I do apologize for getting you this video so late in the day. You'll probably have to do this work on Sunday, and I will do better next time. Hopefully, the many days we have not of class make up for the kind of work you have to do on Sunday to get this in on time. So, if you remember, we looked at the first two chapters of the story of creation and said, they're actually talking about the same things. They're talking about the creation of the world, but they do so in a very different way. And we located some big differences between chapter 1 and chapter 2. And I believe at the end of our time together, before we started talking about Yom Kippur, and before we started talking a little bit about the before we started talking about Yom Kippur, we actually asked the question, why are these two chapters around? Shouldn't they be combined? Isn't it one story and not two? And why is it that we actually have these two stories? And our basically we have three different. So first, I'll ask that question to you. Why do you think these two chapters are around? And then I'm going to let you know that there are three answers we looked at very quickly from these three different sources. One is Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, the Rav, probably the most important modern Orthodox rabbi who ever lived in America. And he says the Torah is representing two different kinds of humans and how they relate to the world. So how would you what do you think he's saying by that, if you think about these two different chapters? And again, let's just look at some of the big differences between the two, right? Chapter 2 has human beings are the last things created. People are created, God creates with no material needed. Men and women created at the exact same time. Men and women created so that God can have an image. Man and women are commanded to increase and multiply and fill the earth and roll over it and eat all the fruit. God reacts positively to what God creates. Man does not react to, and people do not react to the creation of the world. Versus, right, people are in chapter 2, people are the first thing created. There's actually material that's used. Dust of the earth is used to create man. Rib of Adam is used to create women. Woman is part of man. Woman is created because of man, created after man, named by man. Man is created to do all the work that creation requires. And women are created because the man is lonely. And God couldn't fulfill that loneliness on his first try with animals. They're commanded to eat from the garden except for one thing. There's restriction. And God does not react positively or negatively. And man is emotionally connected to the woman that's created. So if we had to say the Torah represents two different kinds of human beings and how they relate to the world, what would you call kind of Adam number 1 versus Adam number 2? And actually, he uses those terms in his book. He says there's Adam number 1, and this is what Adam number 1 is about, and here's Adam number 2. This is what Adam number 2 is about. Now, Mordechai Brewer says actually the Torah is teaching us by these two different accounts two different ways that God interacts with the world. So let's think about that in creation story number 1. How is God reacting to the world? Story number 2. How is God reacting to the world? And if you remember, in creation story 1, God kind of talks everything into being. There's separate days for each thing. And in creation story number 2, we see God looking at people, God saying, actually, Adam is alone. Let me go ahead and make him a partner. So we see, but however, in chapter number 1, we see God actually saying, oh, that's good, that's good, that's good, and then looking at everything and saying, that's very good. So there's some kind of reaction there, but it's a different, so two different ways that God interacts with the world. What is that for chapter 1 versus what is that for chapter 2? And Zvi Grummet says, the Torah shows us an ideal world in comparison with a messy world and asks us which one do we want to inhabit. So how is, in a sense, chapter number 1 the ideal world? How is chapter number 2 the messy world? And again, I will just remind you, chapter number 2, man is created first. God commands. God looks for a helper or someone to partner with Adam. God creates a second person from Adam. God restricts the eating and says there's a certain fruit that you are not allowed to eat, right? So that's kind of our end of chapter. And chapter 1 obviously ends with the idea of men, and chapter 2 ends with the idea of men and women are naked, and they felt no shame at all. Okay, which leads us right to chapter 3, which talks about the Nachash, the snake, using that actually very same adjective of arum, although people translate that differently in that story. So tell me again, give me kind of what's ideal about world number 1, what's messy about world number 2. That's my question. Okay, I just want to kind of introduce you to this famous rabbi, Rav Soloveitchik, who he was known as the Rav. Okay, and I believe we have a small little video about him right here. Let's see what we got. And it's called The Lonely Man of Faith, because actually the very book that Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, writes about chapters 1 and chapter 2 of the creation story is called The Lonely Man of Faith. And before I even get to this chapter, if the Lonely Man of Faith is either chapter 1 creation story, chapter 2 creation story, which do you think best describes the Adam man as the Lonely Man of Faith? Would that be chapter 1 or chapter 2? Okay, good. And let's see what we got here. I hope you can actually hear this. If this doesn't work, I'll put the link in the
There is enormous opposition. There are people who believe that a day school is
sorry about that.
It's literally un-American.
It was too modern, it was too secular.
He didn't look to his right, he didn't look to his left. He never did anything because he was worried what somebody else might think. He did it because he was principled and felt that this was the most appropriate and only way to be.
It was a difficult road, and the Rav helped us hold our heads high. We needed to hold our heads high.
He saw himself as an illuminator of people's minds rather than a controller of people's minds.
I never saw such a teacher before. He was literally a tiger in a cage. Up and back, those flashing black eyes. He was just different from Dago.
We certainly share the concerns of men in general, but at the same time, we have interests and concerns of our own. We are part of humanity, at the same time, we are alone.
He came across as a figure who was deeply torn. He writes about that. He has a sense of a life in tension, torn between two worlds, aware of great complexity. He was heads and shoulders above everyone else. He was unique. He was one of a kind. By definition, that makes you lonely.
I am lonely because in my humble, inadequate way, I am a man of faith, for whom to be means to believe.
Okay, so that was a little cheesy, but I think you get the idea of. Let's escape out of that and get back to our. Okay, so this is what Soloveitchik says as follows, and what I'd like you to do is figure out when he talks about these two sides of Adam, which chapter does it go to? So Soloveitchik looks at the two stories of creation and says the following: it's true that the two accounts of the creation of man differ considerably, and this is because there is there's a dual person, a real contradiction in the nature of who people are. The two accounts of creation that we see in chapters 1 and 2 of the book of Bereshit deal with two Adams, or two people, or two fathers of mankind, two types, two representatives of humanity, and it's no wonder they are not identical. So I'm going to show you these two, and I'd like you to say which chapter does it correspond to. So this is the first one. We'll look at the blue. My life is fulfilled by controlling and mastering my environment. I quest for power and control. I exist in community so I can work together with others to find creative solutions to make the world work for me and for others. When we understand nature enough to exploit it for our own benefit, we have succeeded. And so that's one chapter, chapter 1 or chapter 2, that's kind of hard to understand, but maybe you can figure it out by process of elimination, because this one is, I am humble and submissive. I am here to serve and guard what is. I ask the why questions, not so I can exploit, but so I can be in awe. I long most of all for a close relationship with God and with people. I need people who I can talk to who really understand me. Without this closeness, I feel I'm not complete. I feel like I am alone. To create this closeness to God or to people, sacrifice, giving up something of myself is necessary. Only in surrender and retreat do I create this closeness. So one of these is chapter 2, one of these is chapter 1. And I'll just put on the next page kind of the summaries once again to help you see if you can figure out, here's chapter 1, here's chapter 2. And again, you're trying to figure out which of these are, does the blue correspond to chapter 1 or chapter 2? Does the green correspond to chapter 1 or chapter 2? Great. And here's your answer, right? Kind of an easy way to figure that out is we really only get even the concept of aloneness in chapter 2, and the sense of God's relationship with people looking in some way to see that aloneness. Okay, good. And here's one last piece from My Jewish Learning. It says the following. In The Lonely Man of Faith, Soloveitchik says the creation story offers us a look at two ideal types based on the creation stories related to the first two chapters of the Bible. Genesis chapter 1 describes the creation of what Soloveitchik calls Adam number 1. This type of human is driven by God's commandments to subdue the earth and to have dominion over all other creatures, right? Because at the end of chapter 1, God is saying, like, the world is yours, you are supposed to use it, you're supposed to, it doesn't, right, only in chapter 2 does it says guard it and tend it, right? So here C relates to the world as an arena for creativity, as a means for human progress. You're allowed to, right, Adam number 1 was created in the plural, male and female, God created him. From the outset, humans exist as a community, part of a community of interconnected individuals dedicated to cooperating in an effort to achieve their common goal. Creation happens together. There's this unity. The second chapter of Genesis depicts Adam number 2. Since Adam number 2 is created on his own, he suffers from loneliness. And loneliness is overcome only when God provides Adam number 2 with a companion in return for a sacrificial act, surrendering part of his rib or part of his flesh. For Soloveitchik, this loneliness of the person of faith can only be overcome in the context of a community, one based on relationship with God and expressed in terms of sacrificial behavior, the performance of mitzvot, especially prayer. So Soloveitchik is making the claim that we are lonely until we give of ourselves. And by giving of ourselves is the only moment when community comes. So giving of ourselves allows for relationship to be, whereas in chapter 1, it doesn't. So I guess my larger question here is going to be just a question of it. Well, actually, we'll just move on. Okay, I want to look specifically at what Soloveitchik brings up, this idea of how men and women are created differently in chapters 1 and chapters 2. This is one of the largest contrasts between the two stories, chapter 1 and chapter 2. And of course, Soloveitchik says what about chapter 2? What does it mean that a person is only created when part of yourself is given up? Right, so you should have gotten that from the last piece. If not, you can kind of look back on that for a second right here. Okay. I'll move that for a sec. Okay, great. Okay. let's look for a second one more time at the part of the story in chapter number 2 where people are created, where Adam is there already and God is interacting with Adam, and at the moment right after this, God actually says, "Oh my goodness, Adam is alone, is lonely. Adam needs someone else." And of course, first God takes Adam to all the animals, and then God sees that's not working, and then creates Chava or Eve. Okay, so right. So first we have took God. Hashem, God took the human, set him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to guard it. Hashem commanded concerning the human, saying, "From every other tree of the garden you may eat, yes, eat, but from the tree of knowing of good and evil you are not to eat from it. For on the day of your eating it, you must die, yes, die." And then right after that, God says, "It's not good for humans to be alone, so I will make him a helper corresponding to him," which in Hebrew is this word, ezer kenegdo. That's an important phrase to know. Ezer kenegdo, right? A helper who is against him or something like that, an against him kind of helper in some way. So I want to know, are there any questions you have about kind of how part of the story number 1 kind of goes into story number 2? Because I've got 2 questions, and I wonder if you can figure out questions as well. Okay, so my 2 questions are the following. Why is Adam's aloneness something that is commented upon only once the eating prohibition is given? Like, why is it that we don't hear about? So God, humans are set in the garden to work it and to guard it, and then why doesn't the story at that moment say, and God realizes that people are alone? Only after this command or this prohibition is given does it seem like, in some way, like it's almost as if that might be a requirement for this aloneness to be realized or something like that. Like God realizes that Adam is alone, and in some way God wants, and then God realizes that aloneness is a problem that must be dealt with. So why now? That's my first question. And then my second question is, does Adam feel this aloneness? Does Adam feel this aloneness too? Or is it just God? Like, Adam, we realize, right? It says here, right? For the human, there could not be found a helper corresponding to him. So the question is, so here we have the Adam kind of actively naming all these animals, and it's only at that point does actually Adam realize that Adam is alone. So God actually realizes that before Adam, and actually places Adam in a situation where Adam will realize that as well. Meaning, possibly, and I guess I want your take, meaning like, was there a moment where Adam, or might Adam have never realized this aloneness? Might Adam have actually said, "This is enough for me"? For some reason, God understands that Adam is alone and wants to make sure that Adam understands that as well. And Adam only understands that once the animals pass by. So I guess my question is, why is it so important that A, God can see the aloneness? Why does God see it when he sees it? And B, why is it important that Adam needs to see that as well? Because in a way, right, if God sees a problem, God could have made the solution, but it's important in some way for God to make sure that Adam sees that problem as well. And so I'd like to know kind of why you think that is, right? Because remember, in creation story number 1, where Adam and Eve are created together, there's no problem, there's no loneliness, there's just kind of is, like the minute both their eyes open up, they look at each other and they're like, oh yeah, we are kind of here on this earth. There's no sense of I need, I want, I don't have. But that happens in creation story number 2, and it's really the first person who says, it is God. God needs, God wants, and God realizes God needs something for Adam. God sees that Adam doesn't have it, and God needs to provide. And of course, I think, and Yossi mentioned this, God gets it wrong. So I want to look now more carefully at that story of, and I just want you to, it'll be helpful if you kind of reread in chapter 1, right? It says, and Elohim created Adam, the man, in his image. In the image of Elohim created him, male and female he created them. And we know that Rashi gave this great kind of solution that people are created as actually kind of like two sides. There's like this one person, a male side and a female side, and then kind of it splits off. Right, so that first being the Ha'adam that was created, by the way, and that's the thing that's called in his image. So maybe actually the image of God is more this than kind of separated, right, which is really interesting to me. And then in chapter 2 we have God forming the first person from the kind of the materials from the ground. God blows into that kind of lifeless form a human being, and then God takes from that human being who's now no longer lifeless, but kind of makes him lifeless again. And instead of, by the way, right, because what could we see happen? What do we actually expect to happen? We don't expect Adam to be put to sleep, or maybe Adam's put to sleep so Adam doesn't see how he went about creating. But we actually expect that Eve would be created in the exact same way that Adam is created. But he is not. But she is not. She's created by taking a part of Adam. Why do you think that is? Right. And we see basically Adam realizing like, oh my goodness, this is part of me. She is part of me. Right. Interestingly enough, like you could actually say the same thing by Rashi's explanation, and Rashi obviously is trying to kind of show that these are two of the same stories, right? That he's trying to show that, oh, that would have been figured out also by this. Like if you're separated, then your whole task is to come together. Whereas in the second story, Adam really realizes that she was taken from me, and when we come together, it's as if we're kind of like back to how we once were in some way. So maybe they're both actually saying something very similar. So I want to look for a second at, imagine that, so if chapter 1 and chapter 2 in the story is the story of the same woman, okay? Let's pretend that it's the same woman who was first had something happen to her and then has another thing happen to her in story number 2. How would you, as if you were the woman of chapter 1, kind of moving from chapter 1 to chapter 2, what would be the story that you would tell? Okay? And now, right, so a long time ago, and it would start something like this, a long time ago, I was blank, and then you're not going to believe what happened to me. Okay? So try to finish that story. Now let's go to another idea. Let's look at chapter 1 and chapter 2 and call that the story of two different types of women, okay, in the world. What would be the story you would be able to tell about those two different women? And so here we have chapter number 1, so here's how I began my life. And chapter number 2 is here's how I began my life. What's the story of chapter 1, the woman chapter 1? What's the story of chapter number 2? Okay. And I guess the question is, if it's two different stories, why can't you have both? Why can't actually these two stories exist? What's the problem with these two stories existing together, right? And I hope you see that the real problem is that the two stories of how men and women and how the woman is created actually contradict each other. One shows more equality, people created together on equal standing, and one shows that there's this hierarchy in some kind of way. So the question is, if there are two stories that actually contradict each other, why are they placed next to each other in the Torah? Okay. And this is Robert Alter says the following. He actually brings up this picture right here and says, what is this picture about? This is a famous picture by Picasso. And what is this picture trying to show us? Okay, and here's what Robert Alter says. This is like the technique of the post-cubic painting, which gives us a profile and a frontal perspective of the same face. The ordinary eye could never see these two at once. But but the painter has let the viewer see both at once in order to show us a truer subject matter, in order to show us at the exact same moment a woman who is facing one way and a woman who is facing another way, who's facing us and facing out this way and out this way, and maybe even facing herself in the same way. But the problem is pictures are two-dimensional, so it has to kind of pick a direction. And Picasso here is saying that, I think it's Picasso, is saying, oh, it's actually that it can a person doesn't only look in one direction, they're often looking in many directions at once. In the same way, we get these two stories side by side. There's a tension between them, and the rest of the Torah we see the tension is played out. What's the role of the woman? Is she man's equal, or is she the helpmate who is in some way subservient and weak? So what does he mean by that in the rest of the Torah we see the tension being played out? Let's see if you can answer that. Okay, I want to show you one other idea of these two stories, and this comes from a woman named Judy Klitzner, and she has an amazing book. And one of the people who sit in our class, Emily Rocco, actually read it last year and really loved it as well. And this is called Subversive Sequels in the Bible, and we're going to use it a bunch this year because it's just mind-blowing. But she says the following. She says, she looks at creation story number 2 and says, story number 1 was a story about equality. Creation story number 2 was a story about hierarchy and subservience, right? Man is higher than woman. And then what happens right after creation story number 2? Now, this is a little unfair because we haven't studied it yet, but we will study it on Monday. What happens? The snake tells Eve to eat from the forbidden tree of knowledge. And the snake says, if you eat it, you're not going to die. God knows that as soon as you eat it, your eyes will be open and you'll be like a divine being who knows good and bad. And then what do we know? That Eve eats from the tree and then gives it to man to eat as well. So Judy looks at this sequence of events and says, this story of eating from the tree of fruit of knowledge doesn't come after chapter number 1, where man and women are created equal. It comes after story number 2, when men and women are created unequal. So what does that inequality of man and woman, how in some way does that cause the woman to do what she does, to eat from that tree? So make a statement about that. And here's what actually she says. She says, because the woman's relationship inferiority, because she felt herself inferior, she's actually becomes a seeker. She becomes someone who's trying to kind of make herself equal. And so she's open to the ideas of either being equal or being superior. That once you have a creation story that pits men and women against each other as being who has the power and who doesn't, then all of a sudden you create this dynamic where each of them are trying to kind of get ahead. And that's the openness, that's exactly the kind of openness that that's the exact kind of dissatisfaction that can create an opening for the snake to kind of do what the snake does and says, hey, do this, because the reason it's forbidden is you're going to become powerful through this process, even more powerful than your husband. So here, and this leads to kind of a larger question. Is the hierarchy that's created in story number 2, is it the result of God's master plan, or is it a breakdown of God's master plan? So this is a question that I really have about how the Torah works in general. Right now, if you remember, if we go back for a second to these 3 different ideas of why there were these 2 stories, we have this guy, Tzvi Grumet, saying the following. The Torah shows an ideal world in comparison with a messy world and asks us, which world do we want to inhabit? And so I'm asking the question right now, Tzvi Grumet would answer this. How would Tzvi Grumet answer this question? Is the hierarchy that's created in story number 2 the result of God's master plan, or is the breakdown of God's master plan? How would Tzvi Grumet, the person I just mentioned, how would he answer this question? right? And because he would say it's a breakdown of a plan that actually at the beginning of creation, God presents God's ideal. And then only later on does God create kind of compromises in some way to that ideal. And so this brings up a larger question of, does the Torah work like this all the time? Right. So is the Torah kind of working like this? I start one way. My first attempt is my ideal. And then I realize the world can't have that ideal, so I offer a compromise. Right. That's one idea. Or is it like this, that I start having it not be ideal, and along the way I'm kind of learning and gradually reaching towards that ideal. So it really asks the question, what's the graph of the Torah? Is the graph of the Torah kind of like this, right? Starting here and kind of gradually increasing till I get to a point where people are exactly the way they need to be and want to be, and I'm in this God's in this constant process of trying to figure that out? Or is there, like in the beginning, is it like this is the best it will ever be, and now all of a sudden I am like compromise, and it just like keeps getting worse and worse and worse. So I'd like you to take a stand on that issue and to kind of tell me what you think. And I want to bring up one other piece, but for asking that question, right? So first of all, how would actually the story of men and women contradict each other? So why are they placed next to each other? How would Robert Alter answer that question at this point? And how would Judy Klister try to answer that question? That's a little bit harder, but how might she answer that question? And here's what she would say. She would say, story number one of creation of people that speaks about equality, which is the ideal. Story number two speaks about inequality and hierarchy, and it's a breakdown of that ideal. So in a sense, not only Zvi Grumet, but Judy Klister is kind of that is my first attempt is my ideal, and then things break down after that. Right. Additionally, right, we should look at kind of how these two people view the Torah. So true or false. So according to each of these scholars below, the Torah is a book that begins chapter 1, then we go chapter 2, then we go chapter 3, then we go chapter 4, kind of going through and kind of asking, or kind of how does one story lead to another? How would Robert Alter answer that question? Or would Robert Alter say, true, yeah, the story is a book of Torah that begins chapter 1 and keeps on going? And how would Judy Klister answer that question? And here are our answers, right? Actually, what Robert Alter believes is, actually, the Torah doesn't really work like that. The Torah is it has a problem. The Torah is true-dimensional, but it really wishes it was more like a movie, that it wishes it could show two sides of the same thing. It could show chapter 1 and chapter 2 at the exact same moment. And you see these kind of two different perspectives happening at once. Because it's literature, we read it in sequence, but we shouldn't be. We should be looking at it almost like a split screen of a movie. Judy Klister says, no, we shouldn't look at it that. We should look at the sequence and say, first thing is first. God says, this is what I really want. And then God's like, okay, this is what I kind of want. This is actually going to work. This is my ideal. This is my real, right? Okay. And lastly, I want us to look at one other piece of Torah that actually kind of asks, and I think answers asks this same question about vegetarianism and eating meat. Because if you notice, in the very beginning of the Torah, God only allows for the eating of, look at what what are we allowed to eat in the Torah? And then later on in the story of Noah, what do we see being, what are we allowed to eat at that point? So we see that there is actually a difference. And then what are the things that kind of happen in the middle? So again, my question is back to that question that Judy, that I asked a few moments ago, is in the creation of men and women, is this Torah first starting with the ideal, equality, and then it goes to, well, the world doesn't work where the world works better or some way, or the world works, or the reality of the world is a world where there's inequality of the sexes. Or are we constantly trying to move to a state of better? And then if we look at eating, we see in the very beginning of the Torah, we see that we are allowed to eat only what? And then after the flood, we are allowed, and I know we haven't gotten to it yet, so it's a little unfair to talk about it right now, but we see that we are now allowed all of a sudden to eat meat. So again, that same question, is it that ideally we are vegetarian and God now understands people and says, oh, you can eat meat? Or is it that gradually God kind of gets closer and closer to the ideal, and so the ideal was always that we can eat meat, we just hadn't gotten there yet? So what's your opinion about that? And I guess to end for today, what I'd like to do is I'd like us to look at different commentators who kind of say something about this issue, at least of the vegetarianism. And I'd like you to kind of try to put it in. So this is a Mikro Gedola, which has the Torah up here and a whole bunch of different Torah commentators right there. There's Rashi, you know Rashi. There's another guy named Chizkuni. There's Sforno. There's Minchat Shai. There's Orach HaChaim. And here we have in the Torah this moment later on after the flood where God says you're allowed to eat meat. And so the question is, what is that? Is that a reward? Is that like, finally I've gotten you to a place where you can eat meat? Or is it a compromise? Meaning, is it like, I wish you didn't have to eat meat, but of course now you have to? And so I provided you with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different ideas. 6 different ideas, and I'd like you to kind of look at them, look at each of them, and kind of ask the question of what are they telling us about how would each of these different commentators answer the question? And I don't have the name for one of those commentators, but I'll figure it out for us. Good. So and that's it for today.